everybody. I want to welcome you and thank you for coming to the second CRES talk of winter quarter, the fourth CRES talk of the year. Some of you have heard us talk about this before, but the Program in Comparative and Race and Ethnic Studies and the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture present a speaker series designed to bring to campus scholars and writers whose work is currently being taught at the University of Chicago. This series invites current CRES majors and minors, interested students, and members of the general public to join us for in-depth conversations, bringing topics discussed within the confines of the classroom into an open forum. This quarter, Andrea Jenkins included Professor Renya Ramirez's book, Native Hubs, Culture, Community, and Belonging in Silicon Valley and Beyond, on the syllabus for her course, Urban Indians, Native Americans, and the City. Ms. Jenkins is a graduate student in sociocultural and linguistic anthropology, whose research areas include Indigenous North America, the African diaspora, and education and policy. She is wrapping up a dissertation titled Economies of Urban American Indian Belonging, Cultivating Academic and Cultural Strength through Title VII Programs. She has taught at the University of Michigan and here at Chicago in the Anthropology and Public Policy Studies programs. Please join me in welcoming Andrea Jenkins, who will introduce our speaker.
Good evening. I'm excited to see all of you. Thank you for braving the storm. I was a little worried, but I'm glad to see as many faces here as I see. So Renya Ramirez is an enrolled member of the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska and an associate professor of anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Her research interests are Native feminisms, settler colonialism, family and tribal history, film, documentary, cultural citizenship, transnationalism, and urban Native Americans. She is published in Frontiers, Settler Colonial Studies, Wikazo Sa Review, Meridians, and American Indian Quarterly Journals. She is the executive producer, director, and writer of a film documentary about her grandfather, Henry Rocloud, entitled Standing in the Place of Fear. And her second book manuscript is The Cloud Family, Working and Activism of Henry and Elizabeth Cloud. Her first book, obviously, is Native Hubs, Culture, Community, and Belonging in Silicon Valley and Beyond, which we'll hear more about today. Thank you. And yeah.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks, Sarah, for all your help in getting me here. And thank you for students for coming and reading my work. I was actually kind of surprised that I got invited, like, people are still reading my book? I wasn't really. I guess I'm so immersed in finishing the second book that I'm just kind of like, wow, it's still out there in the world. So I'm really happy about that. So I'm going to be talking about the book. And the pivotal figure of the book is Laverne Roberts, who's Paiute, and she was the founder of this group called the American Indian Alliance. And I first met her, I was a grad student at Stanford, and I got this letter in the mail inviting me to come to this meeting, just because I happened to be the co-chair of SNAGs. For people who are Native, that kind of gets people laughing. But anyway, basically it was it's a Native American graduate group. And so I was invited to this meeting, and at that moment I wasn't really thinking I was going to write a book about urban Native Americans. When I went to graduate school, I thought I was going to write about Native American education. Because before starting at Stanford, I worked in Indian education and worked with K through 12 high school Native Americans. So I thought that's what I was going to do. But when I got this letter and I met Laverne, I became captivated by her. She was just so incredibly warm, welcoming, and basically I thought, I just want to be with her. I just want to spend time with this really warm person. And it was especially important too because I had recently lost my mother who had passed away. And so when I met her, I was just wanting to be more involved in this group that she founded. So I started going to these meetings, originally not knowing I was going to do my dissertation on this, but as time went on, I decided to do a book on urban Native Americans. And I did an interview of Laverne, and I was very captivated and amazed by this concept that she described to me in an interview. And basically the interview was about her life story. The book is an ethnography. I was trained by Renato Rosaldo, who is a famous anthropologist, ethnographer. And I heard this concept in her interview because I asked her, one of my questions was, well, how do Native Americans maintain their sense of culture, community, identity, and belonging living in the city? And then she described this idea of the hub, which basically what she said is, well, Native Americans, they support their identity and their belonging in this hub. So basically I listened to her story and I realized that the hub included powwows and sweat lodge ceremonies, and it also included social and political kinds of gatherings. And thinking about the hub, I also realized that it was not only a geographic concept, meaning something that happens in space, but also that it was this virtual concept. And one reason why I use the word virtual is because, I was doing my research in the middle of Silicon Valley. And I grew up there and actually met this guy who was talking about the silicon chip. So I was also wanted to think of this hub concept as not just a geographic, but also it's this virtual concept that not only includes like Facebook would be an example, emailing, reading tribal newspapers, as well as storytelling. So the fact that I was listening to Laverne's story, that was actually an example of hub making. And so basically I put this idea of the hub in dialogue with all kinds of different theoretical concepts. Because it's so powerful. One thing that because I was trained by Renato Rosaldo, he talked a lot about seeing the people that we talk to, the people we interview, that they are intellectuals in their own right, not see them as informants. If you know the history of anthropology, it's incredibly colonial. And what happened was usually these white men would descend on native communities, especially if you think of American anthropology. They would descend on these communities, and then they would talk to their quote-unquote informants, getting all this really powerful knowledge. And then they'd go back to their universities, and then they would theorize it. And the very people that they talked to, he didn't see them as intellectuals in their own right. Here they were providing very powerful cultural knowledge, intellectual knowledge, but they were not being validated. And so I was being trained to the people I talked to realize they're intellectuals in their own right. And so then I thought, well, let me take this idea of the hub and put it in dialogue with different sets of literature. So I put it in dialogue with transnationalism, urban Indian studies, citizenship studies, and transnational and diaspora. So I put it in dialogue with all kinds of various literatures. And one thing that happened as I was doing the research, I have a very close friend who, she's Otomi. I met her when I went to Berkeley. I went to Berkeley in my undergrad. Her name's Marta Frausto. And she told me that that there were thousands and thousands of Mixtecs that lived in California, and then I met some Mixtecs, and they were originally from Oaxaca, Mexico. And then I proceeded to find out that they're actually the largest indigenous group in Mexico. So then I realized, well, if I really want to write a book that's validating this notion of the hub, I can't just do a book that just includes Native people that are just from the US, because that would really fit within kind of this colonial frame of the United States. And that if I'm thinking about this hub as this incredibly powerful concept, then I need to also include people who are living in this area. And so I also included some Mixtec women as part of the book. And I'm not a fluent speaker in Spanish. My Spanish is horrible, but my daughter's is fluent in Spanish. So she was able to help me do those particular interviews. And one of the purposes of the American Indian Alliance was to try to create some healing across differences in the community. And there had been lots of fragmentation thanks to colonial policies. So there was tension between mixed bloods and full bloods, federally recognized tribes, non-federally recognized tribes. And then there was a sense of tension between Native youth and adults. And then there was also tension between US and Mexican indigenous peoples. So following the conceptualization of Laverne Roberts was one, to write a book where there could be some communication and understanding between these groups. One of the things that I worked with her on was actually a oral history type project to try to create this understanding across differences. So that's why I organized the book the way I did, with these various stories that represented these particular identity type locations. So here's just a picture of a Mixtec who I met early on in the research, who I'll talk more about Leonore later on in the talk. So I put this idea of the hub in relationship to the diaspora literature. And when I started doing the research, people were just not interested in, what? You're going to write a book on urban Native Americans? They're lost, they're confused, they've lost their identity, they're dysfunctional. Why the heck are you going to want to write about urban Native Americans? It was still kind of stuck in this really old type literature. And so then I thought, well, wait a minute. Native people who live in the city, just because they live in the city, doesn't mean they're disconnected to their reservations or their villages or their pueblos. That is really stuck in kind of settler colonialism type thinking. When you think of settler colonialism, it's this fixing of Native people in the land. And if people leave that land, there's this assumption they're going to lose their identity and culture. So, I mean, a good example would be the federal boarding schools, where Richard Henry Pratt thought, he got the ideas for the federal boarding schools because of the history of slavery. And he thought that because Africans had left Africa and come to the United States, that somehow this leaving their homeland would make them erase their identity, which didn't happen. But that was the same idea that happened with the federal boarding schools. And so I put, to try to kind of go against these kind of really parochial kind of negative assumptions about urban Native Americans, I put the hub in dialogue with the diaspora literature. And so thinking about diaspora as this sense of connection to where one is and where one is from, a sense of connection between homeland and current place of residence. So this idea that Native people, even if they don't live on the reservations, there's a lot of storytelling about people in their homeland. There's a lot of maybe movement back and forth. that Native people experience. And so I felt like the diaspora literature was important to put the hub in dialogue with. And then the other one was the transnationalism literature, which basically looks, usually when you think of transnationalism, it's about nation states. And I got the idea of putting urban Native Americans and arguing that they're transnationals from this conversation that I had with someone from Mexico, Federico Becerril, and he was talking about how, he writes about Mixtecs, and he talked about how they were transnationals because they were crossing the border, the US-Mexican border. And then I thought about it and went, wait a minute, urban Native Americans are also transnationals because they're crossing their quote-unquote reservation borders to come into the city. So calling them also transnationals is another way to honor that we're members of our own tribal nations. We have our own type of sovereignty, and that's a way to kind of honor that by calling urban Native Americans who are away from their reservations as transnationals. And also to realize that there's many different types of tribal homelands, reservations, villages, pueblos, and rancherias in California, and also colonies. In Nevada, they call tribal homelands colonies. And so basically this particular, this putting hub in relationship to the transnationalism literature, it complicates how usually people think of migrants' relationships with nation states, and this is like completely challenging that by saying, well, let's also talk about natives' relationships away from their tribal homelands. Then I also put it in dialogue with the citizenship, or this is the urban Indian literature. Unfortunately, the old literature of the 60s and 70s really saw, it was very influenced by classic anthropology, which incarcerates culture in the land, which is part of settler colonialism. So it's the sense that once people leave their land base, somehow they become people without culture, dysfunctional, and somehow cut off. And so if you look at the literature, you see like, oh my God, there's all this like talk about natives being in the Indian bars and they're drunk, and you see these, you know, different films. It's pretty bad. So basically, this particular, the hub really adds to the urban Indian literature, arguing that Native Americans in urban areas remain connected to tribal homelands through travel and through virtual kinds of activities, whether it's storytelling, reading newspapers, emailing. Like right now, I'm writing this book about my grandparents. So I'm writing about my grandfather who's Ho-Chunk and my grandmother who's Ojibwe. So I totally feel like I'm connecting to both my ancestral lineages through all this research and reading letters and everything I'm doing and learning more and more about Ho-Chunk and Ojibwe culture, even though I live in California. Then the other, I also put it in dialogue with the multi-layered citizen. So basically it's this idea that citizenship is not just your relationship to the nation state, but it also it includes gender, race, class, it would include sexual orientation, it would include all kinds of different identity formations. And so if you think about that, Native Americans as members of tribal nations, that would fit with this notion of the multi-layered citizen, that it's not just our relationship with the US nation state, but we have multiple types of relationship to this idea of citizenship. And then I also put it in relationship to gendered notions of politics and belonging. I use Rosaldo's notion of cultural citizenship, which is basically finding out subordinated groups, vernacular notions of citizenship and belonging. And then I also engendered it, meaning putting gender in relationship to cultural citizenship. So usually citizenship is a masculinist kind of idea thinking of men and their relationship to citizenship in a particular way, but instead of using kind of a feminist approach, bridging private and public spheres, and so that way you can look at the multiple locations of citizenship would include the home, the community, the tribe, and the nation state. And then also including emotions, spirituality, sexual and domestic violence, different issues that are not usually considered in citizenship debates. Now, me using cultural citizenship, I've gotten some flack about it because in Native studies there's a lot of you just talk about sovereignty. You don't talk about US citizenship, or you don't talk about these other types of citizenships. But I felt, from my perspective, that urban Native Americans are living and breathing in multiple types of environments where they do have to deal with the US nation state. They do deal with public high schools. They do deal with all these types of issues. So this idea of thinking about citizenship to the US nation state and tribal nations and also multiple locations felt very relevant to me. And so now I'm just going to talk about one chapter in the book, which is towards the end. And this is Martha Frausto, who is owed to me, and she was someone I went to undergrad with at Berkeley. And it was this meeting where natives from both the United States and Mexico came together in order to talk about issues of various types of rights, and a way to try to create this dialogue and understanding across differences from people occupying very different locations. So this was in Fresno, where there are a lot of Mexican indigenous people who live there. And an important organization that helped to organize it is called FIO, or the people call it El Frente, but basically it's an organization for indigenous people in Mexico. So one thing that came up as part of this meeting was the issue of disenrollment. In California, unfortunately, it's very common. We have tribes that are gaming tribes where they have, they're making a lot of money because this is California, and people don't have to go very far in order to visit these different casinos. My own tribe, I'm an enrolled member of the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska. We're across the Missouri River from South Sioux City, Iowa, so we don't make a ton of money. So there's not, and it's also, there's a different idea. It was decided in my tribe that any money that's made is not put into per caps or per capita payments, but it was just to put into various businesses on the reservation, or different, whether it's scholarships or whatever. So it's a different type compared to this idea of per cap payments, where people are getting a lot of money monthly. And the less people who are enrolled, it means everybody gets more money. So unfortunately, it means it encourages greed. And it meant that this particular Ron Alec and his family, unfortunately, were disenrolled. A lot of these different communities, he was from Tachi, Rancheria. A lot of these different communities they have different families where there's tension between families, and then also rancherias that have different tribal groups all living together. So that also creates tension. And so anyway, this is an issue that came up at this meeting. Oops, how do I go back? Oh, okay, that's fine. Another issue that was brought up at this meeting was the issue of not being recognized. In California, a lot of tribes are not recognized because treaties were not ratified. It's a very, very resource-rich environment, gold rush. If these treaties had been ratified, around 7% of the land would have been given to Native people. But because they were not, it was not ratified. We have a lot of tribes who are never federally recognized, which means they don't have a land base, and it's a struggle for them. They don't have their treaty rights honored. So this was another issue that came up at this meeting. And another issue that came up was this issue of driver's license. People who are not documented were not able to get driver's licenses, and so that was another issue. So basically, this is just an example of the hub where people coming from various political locations were talking across language, across nation states, and talking about issues and trying to create a place of understanding, which fit within Laverne Roberts' idea of the hub. So I wrote about it just to show that this, and what I argue is that it created a hub consciousness where people were trying to understand each other across all these differences, whether it was mixed blood, full blood, recognized, not recognized, being from the US, being from Mexico, and elders, youth. It was this attempt to try to get people to understand each other across all these different differences. What I wanted to do now, and I'm hoping I can, is, we'll see if I can. As my second, I wanted to give you a preview of my second book project, which I'm getting close to finishing. I have a draft. It's called The Cloud Family. I have a draft, 5 chapters, introduction. I'm working on the conclusion. I'm hoping to try to get it submitted by summer. So if I look a little crazed, it's because I've been writing like a little crazy woman. So I'm hoping, I actually also did a film. So I have a film about my grandfather that was mostly funded by the Ho-Chunk Nation, and so I wanted to show part of it. So just give you a little taste of the next book that I'm working on. I use the hub again in the next book because I think it's very theoretically powerful. So hopefully we can see it. We'll see. So that's what I have. And as I know, it's hard to listen to someone talk for a long time. Oh, good, you do. You have to know that. Thank you for your patience.
Help yourself to more food while we...
It's so cool that you guys get to actually interact with the people that you read about, the books you read. This is not UCSC. I had to move departments because of budget issues. I was in American Studies, now I'm in anthropology. Academic relocation. It's no longer because of, that's where ethnic studies, now we have an ethnic studies, okay, here we go, it's right here. So this actually isn't the final draft, but you get a flavor. I had a final draft, but we couldn't actually get it going, so. But this is, you'll get a flavor. And let me just see how we're doing on time. Okay, I'll just keep going. Is there, where's my last one? Okay, then let's do the whole thing. View, enter full screen. Now, will it also get the sound?
Yes.
Now, where's the place I started? There it is. All right, here we go. Okay, can you? Okay, I just need a clock so I can go from it. This is my grandfather's singing. It's from a speech he did.
The beginnings of my life has been so poor, so surrounded in abject poverty. The only thing I got perhaps in being born into this world is the possession of good blood and a good shove from a good father and mother, poverty-stricken as they were at the time. I was born in a bark wigwam years ago. And in that bark wigwam, one-room affair lived my entire family. At least, so far as I'm concerned, for the first 10 years of my life, never having spoken a word of English. In that bark room, I was taught that there were four great spirits in the universe, commanding the four corners of the universe. And under them, there were a hierarchy of spirits innumerable. And certain definite authorities and responsibilities were given these four spirits to govern their section of the universe. And under these spirits there were other spirits who could communicate with human beings on the face of this earth, and to those the Great Spirit intended that the red men of America should approach, should become acquainted with, and have fellowship with in due time. And the institution that was set up for this communion and fellowship was fasting periods, eating nothing for days and nights. And so I passed through that regime. And after the fourth day, hunger seized my brother and me, and thirst. And father and mother had promised that we would have something to eat at the end of the fourth day's fasting. In the meantime, we went in the deep woods on the banks of the Missouri to pray to these spirits that some one of them might take pity, have sympathy, then come and speak out of the eternal heavens to our souls. We used to climb the tallest tree in the neighborhood to see if Father was coming from across the river, Missouri River, bringing home something to eat. I longed for the colored popcorn balls that he used to bring with him in those times. In the winter times, our grandmother came in, and she would say, if you grandchildren want English stories, you must first get the wood. And so we went into the woods and gathered all the dry wood and sticks that we could find, because we lived in the woods. And she said that no stories can be told in the summertime, because if we did hear those stories, then we would step on snakes. And no barefooted Indian lad wanted to step on any snakes. But in the dead of winter, there were no snakes. And in the summertime, there was no need of any firewood. And grandmother was very wise indeed to reserve her stories for the winter seasons, when 50 degrees below zero was experienced, and the ice-coated limbs were creeping above our heads, above the wigwam. So we carried in the wood, and we supplied all that she needed, and we were warm in the wigwam as we listened to the stories. She used to tell us about these four great spirits. We call it cosmology. And the world became a world full of spirits to be. She used to say that no child should eat a long ear of corn, for in the races, the long ear would be too long for the width of his stomach here, and the long-eared corn would stick too far out and give him a pain in the side. And so we ate nothing but short ears and nubbins, while grandmother and the old people got all the long ears of corn.
My grandmother was born in 1884 on the Winnebago Reservation, which is right next to the Missouri River. They were forcibly removed because the land was wanted by incoming settlers. The miners came in and they wanted to mine the land. And so our people suffered tremendously.
The first official order to remove the Ho-Chunk Nation occurred in 1840. Investigations into the 1837 treaty negotiations had delayed the process by several years. A majority of the tribe was then forced from our homelands, and close to 1,000 people died as a result of the horrific journey and poor living conditions on the Iowa Reservation, later known as the Neutral Ground, in the summer and fall of 1840. Our removal from our ancestral lands was brutal and heartbreaking. I cannot even imagine the pain my ancestors felt as they faced leaving their beloved homelands.
His people were forcibly removed 5 successive times, which meant that his ancestors were placed on boxcars at gunpoint. And many people died as they were traveling from one place to the next.
A witness to the removal, John T. de Laurent, relayed the following about the great sorrow of the people. Quote, 2 old women, sisters of Black Wolf, and another one came up, throwing themselves on their knees, crying and beseeching Captain Sumner to kill them, that they were old and would rather die and be buried with their fathers, mothers, and children than be taken away, and that they were ready to receive their death blows.
His family had not eaten for 10 days, and his father came back with beaver meat. You know, everyone was hungry. And he told his son, he said, "War chief, you must eat. You must eat first. It does not matter if I die. What matters is you must survive, because you are going to be the future of our people." And so that was a story that guided him for the rest of his life.
He was born amidst a community that had suffered through economic impoverishment, demographic and epidemiological problems, and extreme forms of governmental intrusiveness in religion, in language, in economics, in politics, in all kinds of ways. The federal government targeted Native peoples in the aftermath of these campaigns of removal, in the aftermath of military conflicts. And in many ways, the late 19th and early 20th century is a period of governmental intrusion.
One day a policeman came to our lodge in the wigwam in the deep woods and seized my older brother. They were taking him to school, and while I was yet only 5 years of age, he was my only playmate. I cried a great deal in losing him, so my mother agreed that I should go along with him. And they took me to a government institution called Genoa, Nebraska.
My grandfather was born during a period of time when there were many flu epidemics, and his parents and his mother all passed away within 13 months.
And then they took me to a Sumter mission school in northeastern Nebraska. And there I was taught to learn a trade. I started in a blacksmithing shop, and I welded chains and horseshoes and began to become quite expert. And I noticed that the foreman had given me a right-handed anvil, and the other boys were right-handed while I was left-handed, and I knew that if I did not wield my left hand in the job, that they could make better horseshoes and better chains. And so I asked him to give me a left-handed anvil. I was born that way, and I couldn't be skillful with my right hand. But he refused me. He said that I could work just as well with the right hand. And knowing that I was at a disadvantage with the other boys, and being a proud boy, I quit the blacksmithing work and went into the print shop.
When he talked about what happened in the boarding school, he hated it. There was marching. They were punished for speaking their Ho-Chunk language. From that point on, he said, I refuse to forget this language the rest of my life. So what happened at the boarding schools was fundamental to who he became.
And my grandma told me about, when she went to Carlisle, how she was there for a little over 2 years. And of course, weren't allowed to speak your language. And then when she got ready to come home, she was getting her to get on a train, and she was, boy, just hit her, What am I going to say to my relatives when I get home? So all the way back from Pennsylvania, she practiced in her seat, talking Ho-Chunk as much as she could, trying to remember. And like I said, this is 2 years, and then she had forgotten, But she practiced hard at it, she put her mind to it. And once she got home, and her relatives met her on a train station, they of course talked to her, told Ho-Chunk, and she spoke back.
My grandfather told me that our language was given to us by God when man was first created, and they spoke to one another. They spoke in Ho-Chunk. That was the language that was created for us. That our language should be considered sacred. One of these days, he said this, when our language disappears, he said, our world will end.
In those years, the big off-reservation schools were very similar to one another. The younger you were, the more challenging. I mean, that's a common sense idea, but it was very difficult for those younger kids because you're in this environment that's so designed, so focused on eliminating, suppressing individual identity. Certainly an individual identity as a member of a Native community, but even beyond that you're just you're a cog in the machine. You're assigned a number, and the GI government issued clothing, and the military regimentation. All of that was very consciously designed to develop or reinforce subservience, someone who follows orders and takes direction and does what's good for them as defined by teachers, matrons, disciplinarians, then when they go home, agents on reservations.
Well, the first boarding school was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and that boarding school was established in the late 1800s by Army Captain Richard Pratt. The whole idea behind the boarding schools was to change the way of thinking of our Indian people. And they targeted the children of the Indian chiefs at that time because they perceived they had an Indian problem. And they needed to be rid of the Indian problem. And what that meant was that our federal government wanted the tribal lands. And by taking these children away from their families and their homelands to faraway places where they couldn't run away, they thought that if they could change their appearance and then educate them, then they could change their value system, they could change their way of thinking. And then when these children grew up, that they would give up their tribal lands much more easily.
The Indian race despises a coward. There's a philosophy among my people which said that when the smoke of battle clears away, let your enemies see the scars on your chest rather than on your back. Face forward and win the fight at all ends and cost.
General Pratt has shown himself a venomous creature, and we need to treat him as such. The poor old man is to be pitied for his long-lost fight for Carlisle and his one idea. He has the Indian office in general against him. All the missionaries who know actual conditions are one against him. All he can do is to join forces with people of like mongrel faith, and there are many of them, all willing to come down to the lowest kind of muckraking methods. I would not have anything to do with him. If he gets in my way, I'll hit him hard and knock him out and go on. The trouble with Pratt is, he is selfishly egotistical. He would take the responsibility of recreating the Indian race if he thought he had the power. He little realizes what great harm he has done the Indian race by posing as their greatest friend. He was the man who in the first place limited the Indian education down to the 8th grade.
Okay. So, I gave you a little flavor of the next book. Let's talk about native hubs. Do people have any questions?
I have a question about your next book, Winnebago. I wanted to know why you chose to focus on your grandfather, where in native hubs you focus so much on women in the community.
That's a really good question. The book is going to be about my grandmother and my grandfather. And the reason why I ended up doing a lot of focus on my grandfather was because there was a book that was written about it. Well, first of all, my mother was traveling to archives and wanted a book written about her parents. But she died before being able to do it. And so I inherited a couple of her boxes that just sat in my office underneath my desk. And this was this project she wanted to get done about her parents. And her parents actually did really important work. We haven't gotten to the more contemporary issue. But my grandfather was part of this thing called the Marion Report, which documented a lot of issues around Indian country, and he co-wrote that report. And from there, he was involved in the Indian Reorganization Act, and he argues he co-wrote that also. And that was the shift of policy from assimilation to cultural pluralism, and it also ended a lot of federal boarding schools. A lot of them got closed, was because of his research and his work. But my grandmother, they founded the first college preparatory high school for Native American young men. It was started in 1913. So they did these very important historical things. And then my grandmother was part of the National Congress of American Indians and fought back against termination. And so they did some very important historical work. So there's been 2 books written about my grandfather.
written by basically white men who don't really know the family story. And one book in particular is called The Yale Indian. And it basically is just about his relationship with these missionary parents, and argues that he was socialized by white people, white culture in Yale. He was the first native, a full-blooded native person who graduated from Yale. So there are these confluence of various issues that encouraged me to write about my grandparents and be able to tell the family story, the Ho-Chunk Ojibwe family story. So that's probably a longer answer than you expected. And I'm calling it a Native feminist approach to family tribal history. So I'm using gender, class, intersectional analysis to write about what they did. Yes?
Towards the end of Native Hubs, I recall that the one section which was about youth, and there was the interview subject who living in California, a high school student, identified as indigenous, but he was upset. He was lamenting that there were other students in his class who he thought were, quote, full-blood Indian, and he was using Lloyd Quantum as a criteria, which is like a federal imposition. But he was saying that they were buying into what he thought was a false Mexican national identity. So to what degree do you see both sides in that as right and wrong? And can you really say that identities are wrong in any way?
I wrote an article. It's called Julia Sanchez and Living Between Two Nations, because she was both Mexican and Native, California Indian and Mexican at the same time. And so there I talk about kind of the Chicano identity or the Chicana identity, where people feel like there's a sense of indigeneity. And then also the Native identity, where it's very much tied to being a member of a federally recognized tribe, which often that's not the case. I mean, in California, we have so many people who are either disenrolled or not members of federally recognized tribes. And basically kind of this idea that often Native identity is very much formed by kind of government policy, whether it be blood quantum or even dominant representations of Native people. So one would be that everyone's Lakota, thanks to the Hollywood portrayal. Right? Everyone lives in teepees, and everyone's Lakota. So this idea of identity for Native people is incredibly complicated. And then if you are, say Native and say Chicano or Chicana, or Native and African American, or any kind of mixture, which is really what we are. We're all mixed to some degree. It makes things that much more complicated. So that's something that I try to deal with, just to say that there's these dominant realities that influence how we look at identity. And part of the colonizing process is to realize that there are these dominant issues that are part of. And of course the issue is whether, an issue that come up, can you claim this identity? Can you say, I'm this or I'm that? So often, say in academia, people will say, if they're not enrolled, they'll say, I'm descendant. I've descended from this particular group of people, and this is who I am. So people know, that you're, claim who you are. Yes?
I guess to kind of follow up on that point, you kind of, I wanted to know kind of in what ways are you mobilizing the term race? Because in your, in the presentation, you were very critical, and rightly so, of the idea of an anthropology that was very colonial in nature, that looked at people as informants, not as intellectuals in their own right. And I was based on an idea of colonialism. But you also discuss often race in terms of blood, of mixed And I feel like the term mixed also comes from colonial legacy of mixed breeds. So I'm wondering kind of how you are understanding and mobilizing the term race.
Well, it's such a complicated concept because there's, as Native people, we're so involved in colonial policy that part of just dealing with that is at least making it transparent. To basically say, like say for example, I'm a member of the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska. Now Winnebago is a term that the French called us, whereas in in Wisconsin they decolonized the term and they call themselves Ho-Chunk. Now in my tribe, we're still using blood quantum, and it's a big issue. And it's a big issue because we keep getting smaller and smaller. Because the reality is we're not that big of a group, and often people marry outside the group because you can't marry your relatives. So that's an issue that's come up numerous times, and they keep kind of trying to tweak the policy, but until it keeps being related to this colonial idea about blood quantum, eventually we will disappear, because that's just the reality. So part of being a Native is just to kind of make this transparent, to say, I realize this is racial, this is a racialized discourse, it is colonial, but we're still dealing with the fact that we're dealing with the BIA, we're part of a settler colonial environment, so that the best thing we can do is at least make it transparent and be able to talk about it.
So do you see it kind of as like a political move? And is that maybe how the term is evolving, or does that make my question make sense? Sorry.
Different tribal groups are handling it in different ways. So I was talking about my own tribe. Other tribes are using lineal descent, but then they still are using the government because they go back to a particular role. See, what happened is part of colonialism, it was Native people, we've been so kept track of with all these roles. There was land allotment, there's just so much colonialism involved that it's very difficult to completely get rid of all of it. So all you can do is just, basically different tribes are trying to do the best they can. So some tribes are saying, well, we're just going to do lineal descent. But then it's still going back to a particular role which the government created. So and if you think about the land issue, we're dealing with reservations that were influenced by the Allotment Act, the policy. A lot of land is checkerboarded on reservations, where a lot of it is leased to white farmers. So there's just all kinds of colonialism. So the best thing we can do is at least make it transparent and realize this is colonialism. So that's like the first step, is to be able to actually talk about it. Yes?
I was wondering if you could talk more about gender and the place of gender in the concept of the hub. The book really focuses on the women and also the idea of gendering that space and citizenship and belonging. And I was just wondering if that was your particular focus, or you see hub as really very connected to women in particular.
Well, I'm using a concept that a woman created. And so I tried to make as many gendered type moves as part of the work. I think there's farther that I could have gone, and actually I'm trying to do that in this next book, where I was talking about hubs, but more from just saying native hubs, like the book is about native hubs. And now what I'm trying to do in this next book is I'm trying to talk about how is gender in relationship to these hubs. And so I'm doing it especially in this chapter I'm working on about my grandmother, because she became the first Native Mother of the Year in 1950, which was like this huge deal. Mostly, white women were the ones who were mothers of the year. So she became this Mother of the Year, which was a big deal. But motherhood, if you think about Native people, was very painful, because our children were taken away in the federal boarding schools. So our rights to be mothers was completely being not respected over and over because of government policy. And then also sterilization, just all these issues around motherhood. So I'm trying to, she ended up being part of, she formed a women's group on the Umatilla Reservation with other Umatilla women. And as part of that group, a lot of them became leaders. And then as part of her work with NCAI, she was working with other women who are part of this organization. So I'm trying to talk about it, I'm thinking about Hub also as the potential as a gendered space and places where Native women can feel a pride in who they are and their, say, the knowledge that was taught to them from their mothers or their grandmothers, you know, in these kinds of more gendered spaces. But I mean, I'm also in the book trying to think about gender masculinity, because my grandfather, as you didn't see the whole film, but he was trained as a Ho-Chunk warrior. So this idea of being trained to defend his people. And I'm also arguing that my grandmother was also, this idea of the woman warrior was something that she was also taught. So this idea of defending your people and fighting for your rights was something that was very much part of this kind of gendered identity that I'm trying to explore in more depth in relationship to the Hub. So that's a really good question because I am trying to work that through.
More general question, but I heard you mention a little bit earlier about how you switched more into like anthropological. Did you say that you switched from like American Studies to anthropology or something like that? What kind of made you like kind of carry that out?
Well, I was making a joke. It was I called it an academic relocation. There was the federal relocation program as part of termination where Native people were encouraged to leave their reservations to go into the city as part of termination. Well, at UCSC, because of the budget issue and the budget crisis, basically our department of American Studies fell apart. And then we all had to find other departments to move to, and my training is in anthropology, so I went to anthropology. My book is in ethnography. My chair was an anthropologist, Renato Rosaldo, so it's very much part of the discipline of anthropology. So me moving to anthropology is not really a big thing because that was actually my training. And I actually appreciate it because then I can talk about the colonial issues of classic anthropology in my classes. So it's totally working. Yes?
I was wondering if you could just talk generally about what you see as like the power of narrative. Because as you're criticizing kind of classical anthropology, you're engaging in forms of ethnography and also I would argue kind of autoethnography. What do you see as the power of the narrative? Why is it so important? Why do you use it?
That's a really, really good question. I'm so glad you asked that question. It's actually something I'm thinking about right now. We were watching this film, it's based on a speech that my grandfather gave at this, it was a boarding school at the time, but it was Alaska Natives in Alaska. And he was trained by his Ho-Chunk grandmother in Ho-Chunk storytelling. And that's what completely grounded him as a Ho-Chunk person. And so what I'm arguing is that these stories that we're taught are fundamental to who we are. And he was put into a federal boarding school and was automatically taught all these settler colonial stories. He was being barraged by these stories. But he was very strong in who he was as a Ho-Chunk person and in the Ho-Chunk stories. And so what I'm arguing, I'm working on a chapter right now, I'm arguing that the very strategies that he learned from listening to his grandmother, that he's using them to resist and subvert colonialism. So I'm saying that one is shape-shifting. There's this particular Ho-Chunk story that's based on the idea of the trickster. And the trickster is someone who can shape-shift, transforms from male to female, very much based in humor, and very much based in this ability to negotiate complicated situations and survive. So I'm basically arguing that what he learned from his Ho-Chunk grandmother was ways to actually deal with settler colonialism. So I'm saying masking, camouflage, being able to learn various narratives. So he was very good at learning the dominant discourse. So the idea of the self-made man, he used that. The idea of uplift, he used that. All these different dominant white stereotypes and narratives, he used them for his own, to get some power in the public sphere. And similar to say what W.E.B. Du Bois, he was born, I think, 4 years later than my grandfather. My grandfather was born in 1884, at least we don't know exactly when, but right around that time. So the very things that African Americans had to do in order to survive in an incredibly racist, as well as very, basically Ho-Chunk men were treated as non-men. They were completely being emasculated. They were being treated as children. And so he had to use this incredible creative storytelling, so he was actually able to succeed at Yale, which is pretty incredible, without really any support. So that's a really great question. Thank you.